Hello and welcome to the next part of the Major Arcana series. Today we will be talking about number 10. Halfway through. Woo! Um, Number 10 is the Wheel of Fortune. In Crowley's deck, he just calls it Fortune. Um, so, as I alluded to, the fact that we're halfway through and the fact that we're at the number 10 is a number associated with a sense of completion and fulfillment, because in the Pythagorean system, or basically the idea of esoteric number system, uh, the the highest number, well, that's not really true, but the last number of any importance, really philosophically, is the number 10, because obviously after that is sort of a repetition of a number before it. In other words, 11 is like the number 1, 12 is like the number 2, etc. They all espouse similar ideas. And of course, there are other, systems of numerology in which you break down those numbers into other numbers. But anywho, the idea of 10 is one of totality and crystallization. And oftentimes, the Wheel of Fortune, excuse me, is seen as an image of the manifested universe. I'm also going to take an aside and say that I'm dressed up today because I had work, but also as a way of kind of making up for my really wretched appearance on some of these previous videos. So anywho, now that I look like a human again, and not like a pirate in the previous video, so the Wheel of Fortune is the card that descends from Chesed to Netzach. So now we're moving steadily further down the tree of life. So this is connecting the idea of mercy or benevolence to the idea of, well, Netzach technically means victory, but there's very little about Netzach that I have been able to get at that has to do with an idea of victory. I suppose it could be a personal sense of victory, because Netzach is about the emotions. Netzach is about that which makes an individual happy. But mostly, first and foremost, it's about the idea of pleasure and emotional satisfaction. So I suppose if you're thinking of it in victory in terms of that, then it makes sense. But if you're thinking of it in terms of, I don't know, I mean, I suppose you could think of it as a more aggressive kind of victory if you're deriving happiness from it or self-satisfaction. So I suppose it still works, but it's not exactly obvious at first glance. Um, so it's a very interesting idea, and then the fact that this card connects those two aspects. The other thing is that this is a card that exists solely on the Pillar of Mercy, the positive pillar of the Tree of Life. And opposite it is the Hanged Man, which we'll talk about in 2 videos from now. So the two of them are opposites. I think it's always good to talk about the trumps in terms of their opposing cards, because every card has some card that is going to be a reflection of it on a different level. The only difference is, well, even in the middle pillar, I think the reflection is not left to right, it's more vertical. So art or temperance is sort of on a lower arc, a similar thing as the High Priestess, and on an even lower arc is the universe, which is sort of similar to all those as well. Whereas we're dealing with positive and negative, excuse me, when we're dealing with positive and negative, the shift is from left to right. If you folded the tree of life in half, in other words. So again, the Hanged Man is its polar twin, so to speak. So that should definitely give us a sense of what those two cards are about. But the Wheel of Fortune, or Fortune itself, as the name implies, the interesting thing is that it's in Crowley's deck, he sort of means it to represent technically good fortune, he says, but this is based on context. He says that presumably if someone is coming to you for a reading, it means that something is bothering them and maybe they've experienced a run of bad luck, rather. Excuse me. And so if they have the Wheel of Fortune, it means that that's about to change. Excuse me, sorry, I'm always burping at you in these videos. It's really unattractive. But the Wheel of Fortune is supposed to more holistically represent any kind of random event. So it's sort of like the Fool, in that the Fool shares its, or rather it shares the Fool's spontaneity and love of the random, but it has a little more organization to it than the Fool, which I think is what we're getting at when we say that it's the path connecting from Chesed, which is number 4, and as I've talked about, the number 4 is a number of structure. It's the number of tetragrammaton. It's the number of materiality, and a firm sense of something tangible. Above the abyss, nothing is really tangible. In Bina, we have the idea of form, we have the idea of a vessel, but it's not necessarily a literal vessel yet, I think is what we have to remember. So with the number 4, we have the square. So it has a regimented nature to it. And here we see that we are divided into essentially 3 different figures. And the idea is that these represent, or are supposed to represent, the 3 alchemical substances, or the 3 gunas of Hindu philosophy, as Crowley tells us in the book of Taught. And we are told that they are the Sphinx, Typhon over here, and Hermanubis over here. Now, Hermanubis is a totally bizarre, totally random figure, I think, to have here, especially since the deck is supposed to be Egyptian tarot. And obviously, Hermanubis is a permutation of the god Anubis. But as you can see, it's a monkey. So it actually is meant to be the Greek version of Anubis, essentially. Hermanubis is the combination of Hermes and Anubis. So in particular, these 2 gods in their respective mythologies are associated again with the function of psychopomps. As we were talking about in the Hermit video, the idea of the psychopomp is a god or a divine personage that acts as a mediator either between the living and the dead, or as a guide for the souls of the dead, essentially through the underworld. And of course we know Anubis is the Egyptian god of mummification, is the god who performs the weighing of the heart ritual, supposedly, or in their cosmology after death, in the Hall of Osiris. And so he is sort of this go-between person between the individual, whose heart must be weighed, and the gods, as represented by Osiris, his consort Isis. Taught is present in that scene in the Book of the Dead that tells us about the weighing of the heart. But anywho, so that's where we get Hermanubis. And all of these figures on this card come from Greek mythology. And so I think the interesting thing that we have to keep in mind about this card is that this card is less Egyptian per se, despite the fact that we've got the Sphinx on it, and has more of a Greek connotation. The mythology that Crowley chose to use for fortune is Greek. And the immediate association that I pull from that is that of Zeus. And we are told that Zeus is very much present in this card, but because Jupiter is essentially the god most associated with Chesed, the idea of mercy, of paternal mercy, really, of constructive mercy. Excuse me. But paternity, really, and essentially the demiurgic god, or the demiurgos. The demiurge in Greek mythology and philosophy is essentially and this is very much connected to, oh, for goodness sake, my poor battery is just shot, is connected to Gnostic thinking that developed in the 3rd, 4th, 5th centuries, etc. And the whole idea of the demiurge is that there is a god of the material universe, lord of the material universe, that believes he is the highest god, that has fooled himself into thinking that he's the top of the top, because he has created matter. And he is too ignorant to realize that he himself had to be created by something. And so he is sort of incapable of understanding um, the highest, which is, of course, Keter, as we're told in the Kabbalah, and the supernal triangle. I think the vice of Chesed, or the demiurge, is that there is the abyss direct. He's the last stop before you hit the abyss, and so of course the demiurge is not going to be willing or capable of necessarily contemplating the highest. Especially because he's not in the middle pillar. The highest is really understood in relation to the rest of the middle pillar. But anywho, so that's I think what we're getting at with Zeus, with Jupiter, and the fact that Jupiter, even though he is the father of the gods, Jupiter himself was created, and Jupiter is known for meddling in human affairs. And so that's what we're really getting at here, because the Wheel of Fortune is seen as something, that meddles in the lives of men. That it's the idea is that fortune is blind, and she's just spinning her wheel any way she cares to do, and she doesn't really know who's on the wheel, nor does she care, and it doesn't matter what exactly happens. Um, of course, from our perspective, it really does matter what happens. Um, but the idea is one of interference on the part of the divine. It's the idea that the universe works in random ways that sometimes accidentally screws up our lives. So there is a double-edged sword to this aspect to this card. It can either work in our favor or it can work dreadfully against us. But the idea is definitely that of chaotic motion. Crowley tells us that this card is supposed to represent um, the unpredictable in life, and it definitely is that. And this, we are told, comes from the interaction of these three forces. Now, at the very top, again, we have the Sphinx with a short sword of the Roman order, we are told in the book, which is basically just another way of connecting this all. But the interesting thing, I think, is that the sword is obviously a symbol of the mind and of the willpower. Um, and yet the Sphinx does not represent the power of air or the power of Mercury. It is the power of sulfur. And we know this because Hermanubis, over here, because he has the name Hermes in him. Hermes is Mercury, and so therefore Hermanubis, the psychopompic figure, has to be the alchemical element of Mercury, which is associated with air and therefore swords. And then we know that Typhon on the bottom is must be salt, essentially. That he is he's the idea of death or stagnation. And you can tell, the way I tell this is because he has the Ankh in one hand, but it's inverted. He is, the idea is, the Ankh is a symbol that represents life. Life is motion. Life is, the virtue of life is to go, like the virtue of spirit is to go, because spirit is life. Um, and so therefore to have it inverted like that is essentially to be stomping on that idea. And he is at the bottom of the wheel. He's also serpentine and associated with hell, and we are told that Zeus throws Mount Etna on him. And so he is basically oppressed. He is stagnation. Whereas on top, again, we have the Sphinx, who the last force or alchemical substance is sulfur. So and of course to talk about these, sulfur is the idea of hot explosiveness and is of course represented in the tarot directly by the Emperor. Salt is the idea of passivity and non-action, also death, and that is represented by the Empress, as we've talked about. And the last one, Mercury, is associated with the Magus and is seen to be fluctuation between the two. It is steady and there's a lucid kind of calm to it, but it's constantly moving. It's almost the idea just of motion itself, without having a characteristic. Because of course, salt is still a motion. It's just a very slow motion. So it is very similar to the idea of death and stagnation. It is not necessarily, I think in this case, it is not necessarily total death and total non-movement, because of course the whole idea of this card is movement, and that all three of these forces revolve, which we are told endless times in the Book of Thoth, that the three gunas revolve. And so the important aspect of this is, of course, the idea that the chakras on the human body revolve, that any center of energy has to move, no matter, even if it's incredibly slowly, it still moves, that nothing, even when it seems perfectly still, is perfectly still, that the universe is about motion. So again, this is how this card does represent the material universe, and Jupiter getting in being the Lord of material affairs is about that. Now, and of course, Jupiter is also referenced by the obvious lightning bolts that are striking down Typhon. Now, the other thing about this is that we have the very obvious triangle in the background, and this does, to some extent, represent the three gunas themselves, or the three alchemical forces, but the stabilization of the three. And in the direct, or rather, more or less in the center of them, is the axle of the wheel. This is very important. This is a representation of the whole eye in the triangle thing, which is an old Masonic symbol, of course. We find it even basically on the dollar bill. And it is the idea of enlightenment and gnosis, the idea of understanding and clarity, and revelation of the eye of God, essentially. It's God's perspective. And so it's also associated with the point. Essentially, the idea is that the center of the wheel is Keter, or is Hadit, depending on what system. I mean, they're the same thing. But it's the center, it's the point. And the idea is that all these spokes are just emanations from them. And the three forces themselves are emanations and interpretations of the source of motion and the source of life in the direct center. And it even has this sort of solar motif. If you look, it doesn't have 6 points, but it is basically, for what better or worse, a sun in the center of the card. The other thing that gives us a direct solar aspect are the 6 rays emanating from the fist on the bottom of the wheel. Now the fist is there rather, because the letter for fortune is Kaph, and Kaph means a fist. So another hand idea, Yod, it just means a hand, whereas Kaph is a closed hand. So again, we have the idea of the Wheel of Fortune being turned. But the fact that the hand is given these 6 rays, 6 being the number of the sun and associated with the Sephirah Tiferet, it is associated with the individual. And from meditating on this card for many years now, my understanding of that is that the individual is the source of their, well, when we make a decision, it's sort of like adjustment. When we make an action, we are turning the wheel in some way, but we are ignorant of the way we are turning it. That everything we do is causing some sort of reaction to happen around us. And in order to keep everything balanced, there must be a reaction against our action. So we are the ones turning the wheel. But the idea is that when we attain enlightenment or attain Godhead within us in the center at Keter, we realize that there is no such thing as random event, essentially. That random event is an illusion. Things that happen to you do happen to you for a reason, even if that reason is incredibly obscure. And you may not necessarily have access to the reason because the reason, hypothetically, could come from many lifetimes ago. Or, I mean, this is, again, very similar to the karmic idea of adjustment. But I think the highest, or rather the highest idea that I've managed to get with this card is that because we're on the right-hand side of mercy and it's descending onto victory and Netzach, this is connecting it all back, all these random things are for your benefit. And the idea is that since Keter is the source of one's will, is the source of one's true will, because of course one's true will is synonymous with their true self, because a god can only be distinguished by its will. Since the center is essentially the same thing as saying true will in the center of this card, or this image rather, it is saying that all other events, no matter how random they may seem, are extensions of that and are essentially not necessarily expressions of that, but again, very similar to adjustment, where we have the universe constantly suiting our needs, whether or not we realize that or know it, and even when this is incredibly painful. I mean, fortune is not necessarily a great card. I think we can say that it is, because of where it is on the tree of life. We can assume that it represents good fortune, but philosophically speaking, it does not necessarily represent good fortune. And so the card is incredibly ambiguous, because again, it really just represents motion. It represents randomness. But again, the ideal is that that nothing is really random. Of course, I suppose, well, the interesting thing about the configuration of these figures and the idea that we have Hermanubis instead of any other representation of Mercury. And again, Hermanubis is distinctly a psychopompic god. If you look up Hermanubis, you will find that he is a psychopomp, first and foremost, especially because he is the combination of Anubis and Hermes. So he is distinctly about leading souls from the depths of death. And here we have death and sloth here. So we have this formula whereby from this basically the death of ignorance, in which the universe seems to constantly be oppressing you. Zeus throwing Mount Etna on you constantly. Every event seems like a misfortune. And so therefore you feel powerless and cannot do anything, and therefore you act against yourself and defeat yourself. By Mercury, by the power of will, and by perhaps even divine intervention, we are eventually brought to the top of the wheel, whereby we hit sulfur and are brought into action. We are goaded into action, again, the ox goad motif of adjustment, but we are brought into action here and thereby attain a sense of victory. Again, the sword perhaps being a representation of that Netzatic attribution. And then the idea is, of course, that we're going to eventually come back down here, but perhaps this could be more the idea of literal death, and then we get the wheel of reincarnation. So the wheel is happening on a number of different levels. It's a lot of wheels at once. It's a wheel of personal transformation. It's a wheel of karma. It's a wheel of event and cause and effect. It's a wheel of life and death. It is just, the universe is a wheel. So think about that for a while. I think that's all I want to say about that. So again, the major purple aspect of this is to represent Chesed and Jupiter. Um, that's about it. It's actually a very profound card. It's just reading it I find kind of difficult because it has all those associations, and I'm never really sure what exactly to say about it. I am sort of cautious when I read it for people because it literally just does represent uh, an unexpected change to your circumstances, and presumably it is favorable. But you may want to tell your querent that it might not necessarily translate immediately as a favorable situation. This is a card that I tend to like to draw another one for. I usually don't like to draw other cards because I sometimes it can muddle things, and it just seems like it makes it seem like you don't know what you're talking about also, and of course you do. So but fortune is one of those cards where it's sometimes a good idea to get a second detail as to what that change, what that random aspect is actually going to entail, and definitely tell the person that it is meant to help them. It is not meant to hurt them. Unlike the Hanged Man, which we will get to, and we'll see in retrospect how the Hanged Man is the exact opposite of this card. Okay, I hope you found this helpful, interesting, cool, nifty, etc. Don't forget to like, subscribe, etc. And I will see you tomorrow, hopefully tomorrow, for the next one, which is number 11, Lust. Very interesting card. Okay, thanks for watching. Bye.